Please be seated. In our collect this morning, we prayed, "Open the eyes of our faith." And then in the gospel, Jesus explicitly tells us what our faith should be all about. Namely, living so as to be the means through which his sheep are cared for. Dirty, wet, and tired from fishing all night and catching absolutely nothing, the disciples nonetheless followed the resurrected Jesus' command to recast their nets one more time. The result was the miraculous catch of 153 fish. As an often very, very disappointed fisherman myself, this alone would have led me to become a believer. But John tells us Jesus had much more in mind. After hauling their fish to shore, they were met by him and a fire of burning coals. Jesus greeted them with welcoming words, "Come and have breakfast." When breakfast was over and they had warmed themselves before the crackling fire, Jesus asked Peter not once, but 3 times, "Peter, do you really love me?" 3 times Peter replied, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And then 3 times Jesus responded, "Feed my sheep." This is a masterful literary stroke by John to connect 2 otherwise disparate stories. John says that Peter was hurt by Jesus' questions. That's because the 3 questions by Jesus evoked a very painful memory of a triple denial by Peter. The last time that Peter stood around a campfire was just a few days earlier during the arrest of Jesus, when he denied 3 times that he even knew Jesus. In that incident, John describes how it was cold and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. Both campfire conversations about faithfulness to Jesus were painful in the extreme. But Jesus reinstates Peter 3 times with the words, "Feed my sheep." And despite his past failures and cowardliness, and fortified by the certainty, grace, and forgiveness that Jesus blesses all of us with, Peter went on to become one of the movement's very foremost leaders. But not without an important postscript, a striking metaphor that touches each of us deeply. "Very truly, I tell you," Jesus said to Peter, "when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." This is Jesus' last word to us on what our lives as his followers will be like. He tells Peter, and through Peter, each one of us, that we must be willing to be led where we sometimes would rather not go, to a place where power and control is abandoned in favor of love for one another. This triple play questioning between Peter and Jesus is an invitation to vulnerability and sacrifice for the greater good. And living in this way, we can occasionally lead. This occasionally leads to less comfortable and less affluent living conditions in our culture that presently is highly materialistic, a culture that values egocentric power, control, and gratuitous personal wealth over sacrifice for community, nation, and world. Yet they are words that touch the very, very core of what it means to follow the humble way of Jesus. Through every era, Christians have answered God's call to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. However, their discernment of the most pressing needs to be addressed have varied. In late antiquity, Christians founded hospitals to offer hospitality to the sick, and various sorts of schools to train the clergy, or to provide religious and moral training for children who were no longer receiving it at home. In the Middle Ages, we started universities with specialized faculty to teach theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. Then, beginning in the 17th century, believers like William Wilberforce helped abolish the legally condoned slave trade. During the late 19th and 20th century, Dorothy Day and James Otis Huntington, among others, pioneered intentional communities to address the needs of immigrants living in American slums. As each era has presented its own pressing concerns, discerning believers have interpreted Christ's commission to feed his sheep in various ways that address those concerns and glorify God to those around them. So here we are, 21st century followers of Jesus. What is the defining challenge of our era, of our generation of believers? Certainly the needs I just described continue to plague us. Medical care and education are insufficient. Trafficking in human beings continues. Sacramento being a dreadful transportation hub for that loathsome trade. Immigrant communities still live in fear and poverty. We certainly can't turn a blind eye to these needs, what Jesus would call caring for the least of these. But as his followers, at this particular point in time, are we being called to witness and respond to a condition that Christians have not faced in times past? I believe, as our bishops and House of Deputies have made clear, that there is. As we sit in church today, the human population has grown to over 7 billion, and by mid-century it is likely to increase to 9 billion. These huge increases, coupled with the changes caused by our rapidly heating planet, present we followers of Jesus with an enormous challenge. Yes, the normal rhythm of the natural world involves heating and cooling of the planet. But all we have to do is look around us to see that our choice to burn fossil fuels and other actions that we have taken has accelerated the natural cycle, and we are woefully unprepared for the consequences. As Pope Francis has eloquently observed, The growing size of the earth's deserts are a mirror image of the deserts of our hearts. And as followers of Jesus, we simply cannot stand idly by and be faithful to what Jesus said to us today. We must act. Frankly, it is simply too late to stop the destruction and hardship gradually being caused by our rising sea levels and expanding deserts. But it is not too late to mitigate and adapt. By making Christ-inspired sacrifices of our comfort and lifestyles, and using our time, our talent, and treasure to advance scientific discoveries and technological innovations, we can at least make the plight of the most vulnerable less severe. The majestic creation stories in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 provide us with the linchpin for carrying out Jesus' command to us this morning. They are timeless proclamations of basic theological truths about the relationship between God, humanity, and all that God created. The six-day creation story in Genesis 1 teaches that the universe that God continues to call into existence reveals his presence, is natural, not divine, and is declared to be very, very good. And while that six-day account of creation emphasizes God's otherness from creation, the Adam and Eve in the garden version of creation in Genesis 2 emphasizes in beautiful, poetic, and metaphorical language God's intimate relationship with us and each and everything that he created. These separate stories present great truths that, despite the unfortunate claims of some of our fundamentalist brothers and sisters, science is not in opposition to. Genesis 1, the six-day creation story, states that human beings are created in God's image and likeness and given dominion over all other creatures. Dominion does not mean domination, but refers to the need for humans to exercise responsibility for the earth as God's representatives. In Genesis 2, the Adam and Eve in the garden creation story, the human beings are given the garden to tend, serve, and protect the earth as a sacred trust for those who follow them. At the end of the day, let us hope that we will have the strength and faith to live in the spirit of the old proverb that the sign of Christian love is when we see old men and old women planting trees that will produce shade they know they will never, ever sit in. For our children and grandchildren, I certainly hope so. Paraphrasing Paul in his letter to his friends in Thessalonica, let us care for one another and the earth that has been entrusted to us, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. Let us care so deeply that we are willing to share our own selves in all the ways that show our love for each other and each and every living thing that God has created. Amen.
Amen.